How did black marriages look after the end of slavery? Were they beat up and broken? Were they good and genuine? Or were they in some way or another a mixture of both? Let's find out by turning into Dr. Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery, where he writes this.
Having forbidden legal marriages, condoned the breakup of families, and demeaned family relationships, some former masters and mistresses now mock the efforts of ex-slaves to dignify with proper ceremony and affidavit marital ties of long standing.
They take the white man's notions as they copy his manners, not for what they are, but for the impression that's made by them on the world.
A South Carolina white woman observed of the interest taken by blacks in solemnizing their marriage relationship.
She claimed that Negroes just copied the manners and ideas of whites regarding relationships, not because they actually believed in them, but because of how they made Negroes look to everyone else. Meaning, it's just putting on a show for everyone to make themselves appear like they practice something that they really don't.
Now, what is more common than to hear, "I must go with my wife," not because they have investigated the matter and seen the right of the thing, but such is the view of the white, and the view suits present circumstances, and is therefore adopted by the Negro. One wife is as good as another to them.
That's how she perceived them as a group. There's likely some elements of truth in this, but obviously we know that this did not apply to all of them.
Not all slave couples hastened to legalize their marriages, at least not until they resolved the many complications stemming from multiple liaisons in a lifetime of bondage. The question facing numerous freedmen and freedwomen was not whether to formalize their slave marriage, but which one should take precedence.
Slavery was messy, and on one plantation a couple may be married, but then the husband or the wife may be sold to another plantation and then forced to remarry there, right? So some Negroes were forced into these multiple unions beyond their control, which contributed to the problem of which slave marriage should be recognized.
With numerous spouses having remarried since their forced separation, that would frequently be a difficult and agonizing decision to make. Nor could they resolve the dilemma, as a South Carolina woman attempted to do, by alternating between two spouses on separate plantations.
Uh-oh.
Newly enacted state laws usually validated unions between persons of color who were living together at the time of emancipation and required ex-slaves with multiple spouses to make an immediate decision about which marriage they wished to legitimate. Federal authorities, who tended to take these matters more seriously, recognized the right of a husband or wife to leave a childless marriage to return to a previous partner by whom they had had children.
Whenever a Negro appears before me with 2 or 3 wives who have equal claim upon him,
a Freedmen's Bureau officer in North Carolina reported,
I marry him to the woman who has the greatest number of helpless children who otherwise would become a charge on the Bureau.
Emancipation functioned in some cases as an instant and convenient divorce, enabling a couple to dissolve their marriage by mutually agreeing not to formalize it.
And he's going to explain why.
Some freedmen and freedwomen seized the chance to annul an incompatible and loveless marriage, which in several instances had been forced upon them by their owner.
And who wants to be in a relationship with someone they don't love and they're forced to be with? Almost nobody, right? Now, just like the Europeans forced many tribes from Africa to be one people in America, their white descendants likewise forced men and women to be together in these marriages. So after slavery, this was an opportunity for some of them to break away from that, right? And I don't blame them at all.
In a divorce case argued before a Union officer in Louisiana, the husband claimed he had done everything in his power for the comfort of his wife and wished to retain her, but the woman declared she could now take care of herself and refused to stay with a man whom she did not love.
He fell in love from that forced arrangement, but she didn't. So once slavery ended, she was out of there.
Among families that had survived bondage intact, the difficult post-emancipation decision about whether to stay with their last master also produced conflicts which were sometimes resolved by divorce. More often than not, however, those who lived together at the end of the war did not avail themselves of the opportunity to dissolve those ties, suggesting the extent to which their marriages had been based on considerations other than the convenience of the master.
So there were many other marriages that were not based on force from the slave master. They were based on other considerations like economic support, family welfare, or genuine love, so they did not dissolve these marriages after slavery.
During slavery, interracial sexual liaisons, usually between slave women and white men, sometimes between slave men and white women, had occasionally developed into affectionate and lasting relationships.
They've been dabbling for the longest, and not every single instance was by the force of the white man either. Some of the Negro women respected the swag of the white man, and she let it be known. And obviously the white women weren't forced to do any of this activity. So we know the ones of them that did go jumping did in fact genuinely respect the swag of the Negro man.
Obviously, such ties could neither be solemnized nor legalized, and few even cared to admit that they were based on genuine feelings of love, particularly those involving white women. Emancipation permitted interracial couples to formalize those relationships, at least to the extent state laws and public opinion would tolerate them. When the daughter of a former slave owner in Mississippi announced her intention to marry one of their former slaves, with whom she had already established a relationship, a local judge refused to believe her avowal of love for the man and ordered the arraignment and trial of the couple.
Oh, snaps.
With different results, a quadroon mistress of a planter in Mississippi refused to continue a relationship with her master after the war unless he agreed to marriage.
You see that? Now what happened?
They finally prevailed upon a reluctant army chaplain to perform the necessary rites after the master claimed he had
married her in the sight of God 5 years ago.
Where were the eyes of God to see this? They were his own eyes. So what he's saying is that, from his view, he married her 5 years ago in the spiritual sense, without the need of any formal process.
The difficulties that confronted a white woman and a black man made any permanent relationship almost impossible in the post-war South.
But the ones who really wanted to have it found a way to do so. Now let's keep moving.
Although the courts always dealt harshly with attacks on whites, whatever the evidence, a court in Fredericksburg, Virginia, acquitted a black woman accused of assaulting a white woman who had
stolen the affections
of her black husband, prompting him to leave her for the white woman.
This stuff is wild, isn't it?
That came about as close to justifiable assault in the eyes of the white community as any black person could commit. Neither the legalization nor the sanctification of black marriages necessarily moved the ex-slaves to adopt in full the sexual code of upper-class whites.
Here we go. Their sexual code was that of a single partner and sexual purity between married people. And of course, some of them did not keep this, but this was the code of the upper-class whites, not the poor whites, because they were said to be just as bad and reported by many to be worse than the Negroes. So it's not talking about them at all. That was the code for the upper class whites with the money and the power.
The Negroes had their own ideas of morality and held to them very strictly.
The proprietress of a Georgia plantation observed,
They didn't consider it wrong for a girl to have a child before she married, but afterwards were extremely severe upon anything like infidelity on her part.
So for whatever reason, the woman could have kids before marriage. But after they married, cheating was not allowed.
Indeed, the good old law of female submission to the husband's will on all points held good.
While both races frowned upon certain sexual practices, such as adultery, the differences which persisted in defining moral behavior, such as the condoning of prenuptial sex among blacks, and the post-emancipation complications surrounding polygamy, helped to explain the intensity with which white missionaries and black preachers dwelled on black moral vices, and admonished the ex-slaves to conform in every respect to the Victorian moral code.
They tried to get some blacks to stop sleeping around before marriage, stay with one partner, remain faithful, and legalize their marriage, which was an attempt to impose the Victorian moral code of the upper-class whites on them, right? And this was a section of Negroes that needed this preaching, because there was another section of them who already had stable families and did not do this even while in slavery.
When Clinton B. Fisk, a sympathetic Freedmen's Bureau officer, counseled freedmen and freedwomen that God would no longer close his eyes to
adultery and fornication,
among them, he was saying little that black preachers had not already said on numerous occasions.
Look at the white folks.
One such preacher told his congregation,
Do you ever see a white man want to marry a woman when he had a lawful wife for living? Never. I never heard of such a thing in my life. A white man instructed. He knows that's again the law and the gospel.
Talking to whichever segment of the blacks this message was designed to hit.
Although reports of rampant
polygamy, adultery, and indiscriminate sexual intercourse
among the ex-slaves would reinforce white notions of black moral laxity, some Freedmen's Bureau officers readily conceded that a disproportionate number of such cases came to their attention.
If I exaggerate in this matter,
A Bureau officer in South Carolina wrote,
it is because, like most officers of justice, I saw chiefly the evil side of my public, all the deserted ones coming to me for the redress of their grievances or for help in their poverty.
Meaning he perceived it to be rampant because those were primarily the type of people he dealt with. He didn't encounter many who had stable homes.
Actually, the seriousness with which most blacks assumed and sustained their marital vows, like the intense interest they had shown in locating family members, surprised and elated many Bureau officers and Northern missionaries who had come to the South prepared for the worst. If Horace Greeley, the New York editor, thought
enslaved, degraded, hopeless races or classes are always lewd,
that was far from the conclusion reached by a white teacher in post-war Virginia.
The colored people easily assume the responsibilities, proprieties, and graces of civilized life. As a class, their tastes are comely, though they are acquainted with filth. I fancy they see the moral significance of things quite as readily as white people.
Which is to say the colored people were just as capable of living a civilized life as the whites were.
And if white masters and mistresses claimed credit for the civilizing influences they had exerted on their slaves, the freedmen and freedwomen took some pride in the moral values they had managed to sustain in the quarters, often in the face of the grossest forms of white savagery.
And there was no shortage of the white savagery, as the author described it. A lot of Negroes were brought up in the ways of them, while some escaped it to the best they could. Now let's move on.
That the withdrawal of women from the labor force was frequently made at the insistence of the men reflected a determination by many husbands and fathers to reinforce their position as the head of the family in accordance with the accepted norms of the dominant society. The place for the woman was in the home, attending to the business of the home.
When I married my wife,
a Tennessee freedman told his employer, in rejecting his request for her services,
I married her to wait on me, and she has got all she can do right here for me and the children.
Like many outside observers, Laura Town, a northern white teacher in the Sea Islands, explained such developments as a natural reaction to the dominant place she had assumed black women had occupied in the slave household. In wishing to
rule their wives,
the men could thus hardly be blamed for exercising
an inestimable privilege
of freedom.
In slavery, the woman was far more important and was in every way held higher than the man. It was the woman's house, the children were entirely hers, etc., etc.
Since emancipation, however, Laura Town had observed the frequency with which black leaders urged black men
to get the women into their proper place, never to tell them anything of their concerns, etc., etc. And the notion of being bigger than women generally is just now inflating the conceit of the males to an amazing degree.
So there were some obvious issues with the relationship structure following slavery, and some of those issues became progressively worse over time. But not everyone had to be raised from this pit. Some did, in fact, figure out the secret to making the marriage relationship work. And we'll talk more about the Negro family and the structure in later commentaries. But for now, I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.